Okay, let's get right into it. We're looking at one of the biggest puzzles of the Cold War. You've got the Soviet Union, this massive power that had a habit of, well, gobbling up entire nations. And yet, there was Poland, right on its doorstep, but somehow, on paper anyway, it stayed its own country. So what was going on there?
Right? It's a question that, once you think about it, is kind of weird. The Soviets were not exactly shy about expanding. So why the hesitation with Poland? Why stop right at the border? In this explainer, we're going to unpack the deep and really clever strategic reasons behind that very decision.
So, to figure this puzzle out, we've got to rewind the clock, way back to 1939, right when all the pieces first started moving on the board.
The Second World War kicks off, and boom, the USSR doesn't waste a minute. The Red Army just marches right into eastern Poland. They absorb huge pieces of land, millions of people, and just like that, Poland's entire eastern half was gone, wiped right off the map.
And this is what makes it so confusing, right? They'd already started the job. They were halfway there. So why on earth would they just stop? Why not just finish it and take the whole thing? Okay, let's fast forward to the end of the war, because this is where the plot thickens. Poland's future wasn't being decided on its own soil. Nope, it was being decided by the big three in back rooms far, far away. So you've got these huge conferences, Yalta and Potsdam, where the Allied leaders are literally carving up Europe. And what they do to Poland is pretty wild. They basically pick the country up and shove it westward. It loses its eastern lands to the USSR for good, but gets old German territory in the west as a sort of compensation. And that new eastern border, the Curzon Line, it was exactly where the Soviets wanted it.
So let's be crystal clear here. The Soviets got the territory they were after? Check. But, and this is the big but, they stopped short. There was no Polish Soviet Socialist Republic. They left it as a separate country. And that decision, right there, is where you start to see the real 4D chess they were playing.
So why was Poland so special? Well, to get that, you've got to look right next door at what happened in the Baltic states. The comparison is everything.
And let's just get one thing straight right off the bat. Moscow wasn't afraid to annex anybody. The idea that they were somehow worried about what the world would think, well, their actions elsewhere prove that's just not true.
I mean, just look at this. It couldn't be clearer. On one side, you've got the Baltics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Boom, swallowed whole, absorbed right into the Soviet machine. But then there's Poland. With Poland, they took a totally different route. They wanted total control, sure, but from behind the curtain, like a puppet master. So why the two different playbooks?
It really all comes down to this. Poland wasn't a tiny country like the Baltics. We're talking about a huge, major European nation with a massive population and a long, complicated history. Trying to absorb Poland would have been a whole different beast, a much, much bigger challenge.
And that brings us to the absolute heart of the Soviet strategy. You see, it wasn't just about grabbing land for the sake of it. No, they wanted something more valuable. They wanted insulation. They wanted a shield.
And the tool they used to build that shield was something called a satellite state. Think of it like this. It's a country that looks independent on the outside. It has its own flag, its own government, but in reality, all the important strings are being pulled from Moscow. That's the model they perfected for Poland.
And Poland was the perfect buffer state. I mean, think about it. It was this giant physical shield standing between the USSR and the West. It had a government and an army that were totally loyal to Moscow. And, this is key, it soaked up all the pressure of being on the front line with NATO. For the Soviets, it was the best of both worlds. All of the control with none of the headaches.
But it wasn't just about military strategy. Oh no. There were a couple of other huge factors at play, these powerful unseen forces that Stalin absolutely could not afford to ignore.
The first big problem for the Soviets wasn't an army or a border. It was something inside Poland itself. It was the Polish people, and their incredibly strong, almost unbreakable sense of who they were.
You have to understand, Polish national identity is one of the toughest in all of Europe. This is a nation that was literally wiped off the map for more than 100 years, and it still came back. The Soviets knew this. They knew trying to absorb a population so proud, so famously resistant, and so anti-Soviet would be a nightmare. It would be like trying to digest barbed wire, a massive, angry rebellion that would just never, ever end.
Okay, so that's the internal problem. The second one was external. The alliance with the US and Britain was already shaky, and Stalin was walking a very careful tightrope.
I mean, just remember,
The whole reason Britain and France even went to war in the first place was to protect Poland's independence. So for the Soviets to just turn around and swallow it whole after the war, that would have been a huge slap in the face. It was a line that Stalin knew he probably couldn't cross without turning his allies into full-blown enemies right then and there.
And that's why the satellite state model was such a brilliant, if, completely cynical move. It gave Stalin everything he wanted, maximum control, while creating the least amount of trouble with the West. It was a genius political calculation.
All right, let's wrap this all up. Let's bring all the pieces together and look at the final verdict on this Polish puzzle. So, in the end, the Soviet Union didn't annex Poland. And the key thing to remember is this. It wasn't because they couldn't. They absolutely had the military power. No, it was because they didn't have to. It was a cold, hard strategic choice.
When you add it all up, a supposedly independent Poland was just way more useful to Moscow. It was a buffer, a shield. It took all the heat from the West, and the Soviets didn't have to deal with the messy business of actually ruling a massive, rebellious population or kicking off a huge international crisis.
And that leaves us with one heck of a question to chew on, doesn't it? Just imagine for a second. What if Stalin had made a different call? If he'd gone all the way and created the Polish-Soviet Republic? How different would the map of Europe look? And how would the entire story of the Cold War have played out? It's pretty wild to think about.